Hello, in this video I'm covering some interesting positions from round 3 of Grand Swiss. First position is going to be from the game Fabiano Caruana versus Ivan Saric. Here Fabi played rook g5, offering the trade, and his idea was to eliminate this rook, which is a defensive piece. And after he took on g5, and now he made a mistake. He took with the pawn on g5. Instead, if he took with the knight, probably he was concerned by this variation, rook d2, and maybe he thought that his king would get into a danger. But after bishop e5, rook takes g2, king h3, now the f7 pawn would fall, and the f6 pawn would be a great asset for white. After rook a2, knight f7, knight goes back to g5, and the f-pawn starts running. The bishop on f8 is quite badly placed. It has no perspective. So I think this should be winning for white in this position. Instead, he took with the pawn, and now he allowed rook d4. And white cannot capture on d4, because after this now the d-pawn might be a strong asset. And also the bishop comes into play. Let's say I go knight d2, bishop b4. Now I think that the smartest way to continue this is just to play bishop f4 and to enter the rook and the bishop ending with opposite colors. But after this, bishop e4, now black is going to block on g6, and this is a dead draw. So after rook d4, Fabi tried to continue the game with rook c7, and now bishop e4 was played. If rook takes e4 was played, then Fabi would take on f7, and those two pawns on f6 and g5 would going to be really dangerous. So let's say bishop b4, g6, and if, let's say, bishop d5, rook d7, I don't see how is black going to survive this. So after rook c7, Saric played bishop takes e4, and the point was that after rook c8 now, king c7, rook f8, bishop g6 is a move. And now black is forming a blockade on the king side, and white is hardly going to be successful in using this extra pawn on the king side. And here some shuffling happened. They played for like 40 moves from this position, but white couldn't make any progress. Now a5 is a potential weakness, but even that is not helping white, because if you try something like bishop d2 here, now black can even go king b7, sacrificing the pawn. But the point is that if he wants to capture on a5, he must enter this bishop ending, which is a complete draw, because the bishop on g6 holds everything together. King can hold the a-pawn, so this is a dead draw. So he tried with g4, but white couldn't still make any progress on bishop d2, king c6. And now if bishop takes a5, now g5 hangs, and also g4 is under attack next, so Fabi didn't want to enter this. He played bishop e3 back, and now king d6, king f2, and they still shuffle. And eventually they agreed for a draw after several moves. King b7 was played, rook e8, and there's nothing to be done. And in this position, they agreed for a draw. This position is from the game between Anton Demchenko and Levon Aronian. And here, Levon was in big trouble. He was black in this position, and this a-pawn is looking very, very powerful. White played rook d7 in this position, king g8, rook a7 now. Now the only problem for white is that he cannot still activate his king properly. Levon plays h5, which is the correct way to play. Because if he doesn't do it, then white plays g4 and activates his king towards g2, f3, and d4, and starts pushing his a-pawn. For example, if black just sits and waits with king h1, then g4 would happen, king g8, and imagine that he just doesn't do anything. Now he would play something like this. And here, white's king would just go up, take the e6 pawn. The king cannot move. He can just move to g7 and h7, because if he moves to f7, then rook h8 is winning because of this. And he cannot defend his e6 pawn properly. Because let's say I play like this, and now black has either king g7 or he can waste a tempo with g5. Let's say he plays king g7, he doesn't waste a tempo for this. White can just play f4, and on this he can enter on f6. And basically here black is in Zugzwang. And what can he play? He can play h5, but now after g5, black is in big trouble. His rook cannot move from a6 because he's defending the pawn, and also he cannot move from the a file because of the a7 pawn. And also there is this additional option of if he plays something like this, just rook e8, or simply just play king f7 and force black to move his rook from the 6th rank, and then you take this pawn on e6 and you can go back and take on h4 next. So black has to somehow avoid activating white's king, and he plays h5 here. h4 was played. He doesn't want to allow black to play h4 because he needs to get out somehow. So he wants to play h4, rook a1, and now king h2. He wants to get out from this side. Now rook a4 and g3. e5, he wants to push e4 on time so white's king cannot get to f3. Because of the same problems he would face like in the previous variation. King g2 and now e4. King f1 threatening to go up to e3, so black has to cut him off with rook a2. Now a6 is played, and now king f8. He has to get closer to this a pawn somehow, because again, if he just waits, then white is going to get to b1 first, then go to the 2nd rank, go to e3, and go up to this pawn on g6. If he just waits like this, maybe this is not the best. Maybe just play something like this. And if king g7, then a7. And the king is paralyzed on the g7, h7. And if this happens, now black is doomed to a passive defense. And eventually he would be put in Zugzwang. After this, king d5, king g7, king e6, and here probably a move like rook d8. And in case of this, rook d7 takes, and if king f6, king d6, here, now black would lose the e4 pawn, and the pawn ending would be lost. Because after king f6, king e4, king f4, king f6, and now the spare tempo with f3. And after king f7 or whichever move, now king g5, king g7, and now f4, trying to undermine this pawn chain. And after king f7, f5 would happen, takes, and now the h5 pawn is lost. So, black goes to an active defense. He plays king f8 instead, king e1, and now king e8. King d1, and now king d8. Cannot capture on f2 because of rook h7, and because the king is not able to attack the rook on time, he's on time to push a7. And that's it. Next move is going to be rook h8, and black has to give up a rook. So king d8 is played, and now king c1, a big mistake. Instead, he should have played rook a8. And after king c7, now to go back to e1 to support the pawn. And if he plays king b6, now to play rook g8, because now the king is interfering with the rook defending the g6 pawn. And all these pawns are going to be easy targets later on. So after this, king c1 was played, and now king c8. And now black wants to play king b8 to capture the pawn on a6 and to somehow defend the rest of his pawns. Now white switches to the other pawn, and his hope is that black's king is cut off from the e-file. So the next plan is going to be to activate his king, and also to keep the king, black's king, passive. So rook a6 was taken, king d2 first. Important, because if he takes immediately on e4, then rook d6 is very strong. And with king d2, you're saying, you know what, this e4 pawn is going to hang anyways, but let me first take some time to activate my king. This e4 pawn is going to fall, and you cannot do anything about it. And here black played rook f6. Instead, he should have played king d8, and after rook e4 to play king d7. And now after king e3 to go rook a2. And this would be enough to defend, because now with rook a2, white is not allowing king f4. Because after this, he could capture on f2, and after king g5, now it's possible to play rook f3. And on king g6, rook g3, king h5, and rook g8. And this position is a draw. After rook f6, white plays king e2, and on king d8 he took. And now it's important to mention that every pawn ending in this rook ending, every transposition to a pawn ending is lost. So black cannot simply play rook e6 after king d7, because the pawn ending is just totally lost. And after king e3, he played rook f5, and now g4 was played. Instead, rook f4 was winning, because after rook c5, now he has rook f6. And on g5, he would take and go king f4. And if he tries to stay on the 5th rank, then just rook f5 would be an easy win. Forcing the exchange, or just forcing black to give up the h5 pawn. And in case of rook g4 here, king f3, rook a4, and now rook h6. Attacking the pawn, and if he plays rook a5, now he gets to the other side. King g2, he wants to go to h4 and to attack the pawn. So he plays g4, which leads to a draw. He took rook g4, and now he counterattacks the pawn on h4. Rook e4, trying to get this king on the d file. King d6, and now f3 is played. But now black liquidates the pawns on g and h files, and very soon it's a draw. This ending is an easy draw. And after a couple of more moves, they decided to agree to a draw, because there's nothing to be done. And now he plays rook e8, and now black enters the pawn ending, which is a draw. After rook e7, king f4, now black gets into the opposition, and after king e4, they agree to a draw. This position is from the game between Aryan Tari and Vladimir Fedoseev. Before this position happened, they had a really complex game, but I chose this position. And here Tari played b6. It was a time scramble, move 39, and white made a mistake and played b6. With the rook e4 here, he would be winning, because after king c7, he would capture the queen, rook g4, and now get the knight into the game. With knight c3, takes on d5 next, and even if black captures the pawn on g7, for example like this, then knight d5 would be devastating. King b8 here is not possible because of queen e5, and if king a8, we have a smothered mate with knight c7, king b8, and this nice checkmate. So after knight d5 check, he would need to go to c8, but now after queen c3, king d8, now one more check, and black's king enters the fork. Knight f6, and on king e7 takes, and the b7 pawn is hanging, and also a7 pawn is going to fall pretty soon after white plays a4 to save the b5 pawn. Instead, he played b6, and the position started to get drawish. Black plays queen g6, and now Tari plays queen f8. But now bishop e8 by Fedoseev. ba7, and black tries to stop the a pawn with rook a4. Now white takes on b7, but now queen g7, a very nice defensive resource. And in case of a move like queen d6, Oh, it's a check. God damn it. And it's a check. Queen g7, rook g7, rook g7, and now bishop d7, covering the 7th rank. And he plays rook g8, but now bishop e8, rook g7, bishop d7, and white avoids to repeat moves. He went knight c3, now he takes on a3 first, and takes on a7, and now knight d5, and the position is really reduced. After bishop c6, Tari took on b7, and they agreed to a draw. Because neither sides can use their passed pawn without the other side giving up that piece for a pawn. This position is from the game between Robert Hovhannisyan and Sanan Sjugirov. Here white is better clearly due to his better pawn structure. d6 pawn is weak. And he plays here queen d2, trying to put some pressure on the d6 pawn in the future when the bishop moves from d5. And here black should have played just h6 to solve the issue of the back rank. And instead he plays rook ec8. And now there is a very beautiful sequence of moves. First, white takes on c5, and black takes with the pawn. And now bishop b7. A very nice motive of back rank. Now queen cannot capture, of course, because of queen d8 and a checkmate on the back rank. Also, I want to mention that after rook c5 here, rook takes c5 was also not a good move because of bishop b7. And now it's not possible to capture on b7 because of queen d6. And black faces big back rank problems. He's going to lose his exchange because he doesn't have time to bring back his rook or to defend the rook because of queen d8 check. And also, what is the problem about black's position in this case is that a6 pawn is a big target now. And after dc5, bishop b7, a6 pawn is going to be taken very soon. Black plays rook b8, and now another nice move, queen d6. Offering the exchange and also attacking the rook on b8. After he took rook d6, now the a6 is going to fall, but black tries to keep the game going, plays h6 now. Bishop takes on a6, and now rook a8. White got his extra pawn, and now it's time to centralize the king. He plays king f2, king g8, and now slowly white gets into the center. Bishop e6, rook b6, targeting the b5 pawn. Bishop a2, and now he gives a check. Repeats one more because of the time control, it's the move 40. And now he takes on b5. Rook takes on a5, and it seems like black solved some of his problems. The a pawn is not there for white, but now king gets insanely active. King e5, and now the next move is going to be rook b7. Bishop b3, and now rook b7. King gets to f8, really passive. And now bishop c6. c4 was played, and now bishop d5. Rook a2, rook f7. And now, if he plays king e8, and now rook g7. And now what's said about black's position is that he cannot capture on b2 because of king d6 and rook g8 on the next move. And black is not able to do anything about it. So after rook g7, rook a5 was played, and now rook b7. He's stopping this c3 threat. White needed to be careful in this position because c3 was a nice threat, the last chance to swindle his opponent. But after rook b7, black is simply 2 pawns down, and he's also going to lose his c4 pawn very soon if king d4 happens. And in this position, Sjugirov resigned. The next position is from this game between Temur Kuybokarov and Nihal Sarin. Here white made a big mistake, and he played rook c3. I think that his hope was that after knight d4, knight e5, black had to go back to d8, and then he would be able to capture on c7. Instead of rook c3 here, better was just to pin the knight on c6, and in case black plays some logical move like rook d8 to step away from the pin, then he would capture, and after knight c6, knight e5 would be nice. And now if he takes on d4, you take on c7, and it's equal position. But instead, rook c3, and now on knight d4, knight e5, I think that white overlooked this move, knight d5. A nice intermezzo move, which now allows black to hold on to his pawn. And now he goes back to c1, rook e7, and now bishop f1. He goes back because the threat was knight f4 maybe, or something else, but still bishop h3 is coming. Using the small tactic, knight is under attack now, knight c4, and now rook g6, pinning the king. And now he plays rook d1. Probably it was better to play king h2, but after knight f4 still, g2 pawn is under strong pressure, so it's not nice be white here. g2 pawn is also going to hang, and the position just collapses. But rook d1 just leads to a quick finish. After knight f3, king h1, and now Nihal Sarin played bishop g2. And the point was that after bishop g2, rook e4 happens, and white is not able to defend from rook h4 checkmate. So white just took on f3, and rook h4 was a checkmate. This position is from the game between Jorge Cori and Aleksandar Indjic. Black was completely lost in this game, and he managed somehow to generate counterplay. So here black played queen h5, and now white plays queen d2. I think the simplest way to finish this game was to play knight d4, cd4, and c5. And by playing like this, you either create a c-path pawn or you open up black's king. For example, if he takes on c5, now the king is in big danger. The g file is cut off. Black's king doesn't have any useful squares to go. And it seems like white is going to win easily this one. And in case of king e5, then c6 or cd6 would be just awful for black. Just take on d6, and black has to worry even about the d-pawn queening. Instead, he played queen d2, which allows rook b8 and some counterplay, because Now knight 94 doesn't work because of rook b1 and this checkmate. So he plays 93 here. It was better to keep the b1 covered by queen d3, but it's still very unclear. The engine says it's winning for white, but it's not as clear as the variation with the knight d4, which you can see now. And in case of what else to do? If he plays king g2, again, rook b1 is a very strong response. And in case of queen h6, takes, he would have rook b2. And now the a pawn is weak. And these two pawns might be able to run pretty soon. But Peruvian Grandmaster made a mistake and he played 93. So Indjic played rook b1, knight f1 was played, and now bishop e5. And here I think the best way to fight was to play queen d3. And black can captures back, and now bishop f4. And the ending is more pleasant for black, because the knight is stuck to f1, defending from checks on h2. Black has also the h-passed pawn, and the endgame is in general better for black. But instead he makes it much worse by playing king g2, and now Indjic plays nicely. Rook f1, king f1, and now bishop g3. fg and queen h1, king f2, queen h2, and now first he captures on g3, creating a passed pawn, and now he wants to capture one more pawn, and then to exchange queens. King d1, queen g4, nice check, king c2, and now queen takes e4. And on a move like king c1, he can capture on c4, and then exchange queens either with queen b4 or queen d4, depending where the white king goes. If he goes to d1, then queen d4. If he goes to b1, then queen b4. And what else? If king b2, then queen d4 would also exchange queens, and then the h-pawn is just going to run. So Cori chose king c3, but now Indjic plays queen d4. Now white is forced to capture, and now the h-pawn is running. If white tries to catch this pawn, black is simply going to give up this pawn, get closer to these pawns, capture them, and finish the game. So he tried with c5 to create a passed pawn on d file, but now black took and played h4. And here white resigned, because if he plays d6 here, black would push, and on d7 he would just get closer to e7, and on king c6, king d8 was important, because if he plays h2, then king c7 is a draw, because on the next move he is promoting. That's it, and thank you for watching. Bye.